Emily Davis, a 32-year-old black nurse with years of experience, walked into her shift at the bustling city hospital. The long hours, high-pressure cases, and constant adrenaline of the emergency room had become second nature to her. Despite the exhaustion that always pulled at her by the end of each shift, Emily moved through the hallways with grace and confidence. Her colleagues respected her immensely for her skills and professionalism, even if she occasionally had to deal with patients and families who judged her on appearances rather than her capabilities. As Emily passed the nurse's station, she was greeted by Dr. Sarah Patel, the head of the ER. Sarah had been one of Emily's strongest supporters over the years, recognizing her as one of the most competent nurses on the team. "Morning, Emily. Looks like it's going to be one of those days," Dr. Patel said with a knowing smile, glancing at the board full of critical cases. "Isn't it always?" Emily replied, her tone light, though her mind was already switching into work mode. She scanned the patient roster, mentally preparing for what was coming. Just then, an urgent call came through the intercom. "Trauma team to the ER. Severe accident. ETA 5 minutes." Emily's eyes narrowed as she quickly gathered supplies. She knew that the next few hours were about to be intense. Within minutes, the ER was flooded with paramedics rushing a stretcher through the doors. On it lay Michael Reynolds, a 25-year-old man covered in blood, his body limp and unconscious. Emily didn't hesitate. She took charge, barking orders to the trauma team while assessing Michael's condition. "He's got multiple fractures and internal bleeding," one of the paramedics said quickly. "We stabilized him as best we could, but he's losing blood fast." Emily's heart raced, but her hands remained steady as she worked. "Get me 10 units of O-negative stat," she commanded. Her team moved with precision, trusting her leadership implicitly. As Emily worked to stabilize Michael, the doors of the ER flew open again. John and Margaret Reynolds, Michael's parents, rushed inside. John, a tall man in his 50s with graying hair, was clearly a man accustomed to being in control. Margaret, though quieter, had an air of privilege about her that matched her husband's imposing demeanor. John's eyes immediately landed on Emily as she worked. "Who's in charge here?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the noise of the ER. Dr. Patel stepped forward. "Mr. Reynolds, your son is in critical condition, but we're doing everything we can. Nurse Davis is one of our best, and she's leading the team." John's eyes narrowed as he looked at Emily. "I want someone more experienced, someone more qualified," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. Emily kept her focus on Michael, ignoring the sting of his words. She was used to this, used to proving herself over and over again. Her hands moved deftly as she monitored his vitals, knowing that any distraction could cost a life. Dr. Patel's voice remained calm. "Nurse Davis is more than qualified. Your son is in good hands." But John wasn't convinced. His distrust was palpable, and Margaret stood beside him, her silence echoing his unspoken prejudice. As the minutes ticked by, Michael's condition worsened. His blood pressure was dropping rapidly, and his heart rate was becoming erratic. "BP's plummeting," one of the nurses reported. Emily didn't flinch. "We need to get that blood running faster," she said, her voice steady. "Prepare for intubation. We can't afford to lose him now." Just as Emily was about to administer a life-saving intervention, John stormed forward. "Stop!" he shouted. "I told you I want someone else. I want her off this case." Emily's jaw tightened, but she didn't look up. "Mr. Reynolds, I understand your concerns, but your son's condition is critical. I need to act now, or we'll lose him." Dr. Patel stepped in again, her tone firmer this time. "Mr. Reynolds, please. We don't have time for this. Emily knows what she's doing." For a brief moment, John hesitated, his eyes flicking between Emily and his son. But before he could say another word, the monitors blared. Michael's heart rate had flatlined. "Get the crash cart!" Emily shouted, springing into action. Her hands flew to the defibrillator paddles, and the room held its breath. "Clear!" Emily called, sending a shock through Michael's body. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone watched the monitors. Still nothing. "Charge to 200. Clear!" Emily's voice was strong, unwavering. She sent another shock through his chest, willing his heart to start. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the monitor beeped. Michael's heartbeat returned, weak but steady. Emily let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "We've got a pulse," she said quietly. But as the team began stabilizing Michael, John's voice cut through the relief. "That's it? Is that the best you can do?" he scoffed. Emily met his glare briefly before turning back to her patient. She had saved his son's life, but in John's eyes, it wasn't enough. After the immediate crisis was over, Emily stepped outside the trauma room, leaning against the cool hospital wall to steady herself. The tension of the last hour clung to her, a familiar weight. She had been here before, saving lives only to be met with suspicion and disrespect because of who she was. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath to calm her racing thoughts. The prejudice she faced wasn't new, but it never hurt any less. Still, she couldn't let it affect her work. She couldn't afford to. Her brief reprieve was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. John Reynolds was coming toward her, his face set in a scowl. "I don't appreciate being ignored," he said, his voice low but simmering with anger. "I'm a donor to this hospital. I have every right to demand the best for my son." Emily straightened, exhaustion giving way to a quiet resolve. "And you're getting the best, Mr. Reynolds. I've been doing this for over a decade. I know how to handle emergencies." John scoffed, his eyes sweeping over her with thinly veiled contempt. "You're not who I would have chosen." Emily met his gaze unflinchingly. "I'm here to save lives, not win approval." Before John could respond, Dr. Patel stepped out of the trauma room, her expression serious. "Mr. Reynolds, we need to talk about Michael's next steps. This isn't the time or place for personal grievances." John shot Emily one last look before following Dr. Patel. His frustration was evident in every stiff movement. Emily watched them go, feeling a pang of disappointment settle in her chest. She had faced this kind of prejudice before, but it never seemed to sting any less. Later that evening, Emily sat in the hospital's small break room, nursing a cup of coffee and replaying the events of the day in her mind. Her hands trembled slightly from the adrenaline that had coursed through her veins during the crisis. A fellow nurse, Carla, entered the room and gave Emily a sympathetic look. "Rough day?" she asked, pouring herself a cup of coffee. Emily nodded, offering a tired smile. "You could say that." Carla sat down beside her. "You did great out there. Don't let them get to you." "It's not about them," Emily said, her gaze distant. "It's about the patient. I just want him to be okay." Before Carla could respond, the shrill sound of a code blue echoed through the hallways. Emily shot up, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "That's Michael's room," she said, already moving toward the door. The break was over. It was time to fight for his life once more. Emily rushed back into the trauma room, her heart pounding as she saw the chaos unfold again. Michael's monitors were blaring, his vitals plummeting as his body seized under the strain of his injuries. The room was once again filled with medical staff, but this time the tension felt heavier, more urgent. "He's coding again!" one of the nurses shouted. Without hesitation, Emily took command. "Get the crash cart," she ordered, her voice cutting through the panic like a sharp blade. Her hands moved with precision, applying the defibrillator paddles to Michael's chest. The room held its collective breath as she called out, "Clear!" The jolt sent Michael's body jerking off the bed, but the monitor still showed no sign of improvement. "Charge to 300, clear," she commanded again, her hands steady despite the gravity of the moment. A long pause followed, filled only by the hum of machines and the frantic whispers of the medical team. Finally, the steady beep of a heartbeat filled the room. Michael's vitals stabilized, but it was clear to everyone that he was still in critical condition. Emily exhaled, feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion wash over her. She had saved his life again, but it wasn't over yet. John and Margaret watched through the window, their faces pale with fear. For the first time, Emily saw something shift in their expressions, an understanding perhaps of just how close they were to losing their son. But as the moments passed, John's face hardened once again, his old biases creeping back in. After the crisis, Emily left the trauma room, feeling the weight of the day bearing down on her. She leaned against the wall, her hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline rush. She had saved Michael's life twice now, but she knew it wouldn't be enough to break through the Reynolds prejudices. Just as she was about to head to the nurse's station, Margaret approached her steps hesitant. For a moment, Emily thought she might offer a word of thanks, but instead, Margaret's eyes filled with a mixture of fear and distrust. "Is he going to be okay?" Margaret asked, her voice quiet but laced with anxiety. Emily nodded, keeping her tone professional. We're doing everything we can, Mrs. Reynolds. Your son is stable for now, but he's still in critical condition. We'll continue monitoring him closely. Margaret's gaze dropped to the floor, her fingers nervously twisting the strap of her handbag. I don't know what to say, she whispered. You don't have to say anything, Emily replied softly. We're here to help. Margaret looked up, meeting Emily's eyes for the briefest moment before turning away. Emily watched her retreat down the hallway, a small glimmer of doubt flickering in her mind. Just perhaps Margaret was beginning to see her for who she truly was, a dedicated nurse, not the stereotype they had imagined. Meanwhile, John paced the hallways, his frustration building with every passing minute. He couldn't stand the thought of leaving his son's life in the hands of someone he didn't trust. In his mind, he still couldn't separate Emily's race from his preconceived notions of competence. He stormed into the hospital administrator's office, demanding to speak with Mr. Jenkins, the head of hospital administration. Mr. Jenkins, a calm and level-headed man, greeted John with caution. Mr. Reynolds, what can I do for you? John didn't waste time. I want Nurse Davis removed from my son's case. She nearly lost him, and I refuse to sit by while someone less qualified is responsible for my boy's life. Mr. Jenkins leaned forward, his expression calm but firm. Mr. Reynolds, I understand your concerns. However, I've reviewed Nurse Davis' performance. She has been instrumental in stabilizing your son, not once but twice. Our entire team, including Dr. Patel, supports her involvement in his care. John's mouth tightened into a thin line. I don't care about her record. I have the right to request another nurse. Mr. Jenkins nodded slowly. You do, but I'd advise you to consider the medical team's recommendation. Nurse Davis has handled cases like your son's before, and her experience is invaluable. Removing her now could be detrimental to Michael's care. John's anger simmered beneath the surface, but he knew he was backed into a corner. The hospital wouldn't budge, and deep down, he couldn't deny the fact that Emily had saved Michael's life. Twice. Fine, John muttered, his voice low with barely contained frustration. But if anything goes wrong, I'll hold this hospital accountable. Back in the break room, Emily sat with her head in her hands, the exhaustion of the day finally catching up with her. She had faced prejudice her whole life, but something about this situation felt heavier, more personal. The Reynolds family's dismissal of her skills, despite all she had done, gnawed at her. Her phone buzzed and she saw it was her mother calling. Smiling, she answered. Hi, Mom. Hey, baby, her mother's warm voice filled the line. How are you holding up? You sound tired. I am, Emily admitted. It's been a rough day. There's this patient, his family, they don't think I'm good enough. Her mother's voice was soft but filled with a quiet strength. You've always been strong, Emily. You know who you are, and you know what you're capable of. Don't let anyone take that away from you. I know, Emily said, blinking back tears. But it's hard when it feels like no matter what I do, it's never enough. Her mother was silent for a moment, then said, Grace isn't about what others deserve. It's about what you choose to give, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. You've got a big heart, Emily, and that's why you're the best at what you do. Emily smiled through her tears, her heart swelling with renewed purpose. Thanks, Mom. I needed that. You've got this, baby. Just keep doing what you do best. They talked for a few more minutes before Emily hung up, feeling a new sense of determination. She wouldn't let the Reynolds prejudice define her. She had a job to do, and she would do it to the best of her ability, no matter what they thought of her. Michael's condition remained critical, though stable, for the next few days. Emily worked tirelessly, keeping a close eye on his vitals, adjusting his medications, and ensuring that his recovery stayed on track. John continued to hover, his distrust of Emily never far from the surface. He made passive-aggressive comments, questioning her every decision, while Margaret remained quietly on edge, caught between her loyalty to her husband and the growing recognition that Emily was their son's lifeline. One evening, as Emily made her rounds, John stopped her in the hallway. His face was lined with exhaustion, but his eyes still held the same hard edge. How much longer until he's out of the wood? He asked, his tone clipped. It's hard to say, Emily replied evenly. He's stable for now, but recovery can be unpredictable. We're doing everything we can." John crossed his arms, his frustration palpable. "I don't understand why you're still the one in charge. Shouldn't there be someone more senior overseeing this?" Emily's patience was wearing thin, but she kept her voice calm. "Dr. Patel is overseeing the case, and I've been handling critical patients like your son for over a decade." John scoffed, his eyes narrowing. "You're not who I would have chosen." Emily met his gaze, unflinching. "I'm not here to be chosen, Mr. Reynolds. I'm here to save your son's life." As the days wore on, Margaret began spending more and more time alone in the hospital chapel. She found solace in the quiet space, away from the noise of the hospital and the weight of her husband's constant anger. One afternoon, while sitting in the pews, she noticed Emily enter the chapel quietly. Margaret watched as Emily lit a candle and bowed her head in prayer, her expression calm yet weary. For the first time, Margaret saw her not just as a nurse, but as a person. Someone who had fought tirelessly for her son's life, despite the way they had treated her. "Thank you," Margaret whispered under her breath, though she wasn't sure Emily heard her. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a small crack in the wall of prejudice that had surrounded her heart for so long. A week had passed, and Michael's condition remained precarious. Despite the life-saving interventions Emily had performed, his recovery was far from guaranteed. The tension in the Reynolds family was palpable, especially between John and Margaret. While Margaret had begun to soften toward Emily, John's frustration was reaching its peak. As Emily prepared to begin her shift one evening, she was met by Dr. Patel at the nurse's station. "Emily, Michael's condition is deteriorating again," Dr. Patel said quietly. "You need to get in there immediately." Emily nodded, her mind already focused on the task ahead. She rushed to Michael's room, where the monitors were blaring once again. His heart rate was erratic, and his blood pressure was dropping dangerously low. Inside the room, John and Margaret stood by Michael's bed, watching helplessly as the team tried to stabilize him. John's face was a mask of fear and anger. "Why isn't he getting better?" John demanded, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. "What are you people doing?" Emily pushed past the tension, stepping up to the bed. "We need to act quickly," she instructed her team, her voice firm and steady. "Prepare to intubate and get another unit of O-negative." The room moved in a flurry of activity. Emily worked with precision, her hands moving deftly as she monitored Michael's vitals and directed the team. Her calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the growing panic in the room. As Emily adjusted the IV line, she felt John's eyes on her, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. "This is unacceptable," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I want her off this case." Margaret placed a hand on his arm, her expression conflicted. "John, she's the one keeping him alive." John glared at her. "I don't care. I don't trust her." But before John could say anything else, the monitor flatlined again. "We're losing him," one of the nurses said, her voice tense. Emily snapped into action. "Get the crash cart, now!" John's protests were drowned out by the urgency of the moment. Emily positioned the defibrillator paddles on Michael's chest, her face set with grim determination. "Clear," she called out, sending a shock through Michael's body. The room was silent as everyone watched the monitor, hoping for a sign of life. Nothing. "Charge to 300, Emily ordered, her voice unwavering. She looked up briefly, locking eyes with Margaret, who stood frozen by the door. "Clear!" Another shock, another moment of tense silence. Then finally the monitor beeped. Michael's heart rate stabilized, and his breathing became more regular. Emily exhaled in relief, her hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline rush. She had saved him again, but the battle wasn't over. John stood by the window, his face pale with fear. He had just watched Emily save his son's life for the third time, but the acknowledgement of her skill was still buried beneath years of prejudice. Later that evening, John found himself pacing the hospital corridor, unable to shake the frustration that gnawed at him. He felt helpless, watching his son teeter between life and death, and yet, despite everything, he couldn't bring himself to fully trust the nurse who had saved Michael's life multiple times. As Emily walked down the hallway to check on Michael's status, John stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "I want to know what's going on," he demanded, his voice hard. "Why isn't he getting better? Why isn't there more progress?" Emily kept her voice calm, though she could feel the tension rising between them. Mr. Reynolds, your son is stable for now, but recovery is a slow process. We're doing everything we can. John's face flushed with frustration. That's not good enough, he snapped. I want to see results. I want to know that he's going to be okay, and I'm tired of you giving me the same answers over and over. Emily met his gaze, her expression steady. I understand that this is difficult, but you need to trust the process. Your son has been through a lot, and recovery takes time. I don't trust you, John spat, his words cutting through the air like a knife. I've seen enough to know that you're not the right person for this job. Emily's jaw tightened, but she refused to back down. I've been doing this for over 10 years, Mr. Reynolds. I'm qualified to care for your son, and I will continue to do everything in my power to help him recover. For a moment, John stared at her, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, Margaret appeared beside him. John, she said softly, placing a hand on his arm. She's right. You need to stop this. John turned to his wife, his face a mask of confusion. What are you talking about? Margaret's voice was quiet but firm. Emily has saved Michael's life 3 times now. You need to trust her. I know it's hard, but she's the best chance our son has. John's expression wavered, the walls of his resistance beginning to crack. For the first time, he seemed to truly consider what Margaret was saying. Think about it, John, Margaret continued, her eyes soft with emotion. If it weren't for her, Michael wouldn't even be here right now. John swallowed hard, his gaze shifting between his wife and the nurse who had been the subject of his distrust for so long. He could feel the weight of his pride pressing down on him, but something in him had begun to change. He didn't want to admit it, but he couldn't deny the truth any longer. Without another word, John turned and walked away, leaving Margaret and Emily standing in the hallway. Emily watched him go, feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion. She wasn't sure if he had truly changed, but it was a start. As the night wore on, Margaret found herself drawn to the hospital chapel once again. It had become her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the chaos of the hour and reflect on everything that had happened. She sat in one of the pews, her hands clasped in her lap, staring at the flickering candles on the altar. Her mind was filled with thoughts of Michael, but also of Emily. She had been so quick to judge the nurse, so quick to doubt her abilities based on nothing more than preconceived notions. Now she couldn't help but feel ashamed. As she sat in quiet contemplation, the door to the chapel opened, and Emily stepped inside. She moved quietly, not noticing Margaret at first, and made her way to the front of the room to light a candle. Margaret watched as Emily bowed her head, offering a silent prayer for Michael's recovery. The sight of the nurse, so composed and graceful, stirred something deep within Margaret. For the first time, she saw Emily not just as a nurse, but as a person, a woman who had fought for her son's life with unwavering resolve. Thank you, Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. Emily turned, surprised to see Margaret sitting there. She gave a small nod, acknowledging the quiet gratitude. You're welcome, Emily said softly before turning to leave the chapel. Margaret watched her go, her heart heavy with the weight of her own realizations. Over the next few days, Margaret began to see Emily in a new light. She watched closely as Emily cared for Michael, her actions steady and deliberate, her focus never wavering. Margaret had always thought of herself as a fair person, but now she realized just how deeply her biases had clouded her judgment. John, on the other hand, remained conflicted. He was still grappling with his own feelings, torn between his pride and the undeniable truth that Emily had saved his son's life. He spent long hours sitting by Michael's bedside, watching as Emily moved in and out of the room, her presence a constant reminder of the battle he was fighting within himself. One afternoon, as Margaret and John sat together in the waiting area, she turned to him and spoke quietly. She's more than just a nurse, Margaret said, her voice soft but firm. She's the reason Michael is still alive. John didn't respond immediately, his eyes fixed on the floor. After a long pause, he nodded slowly. I know, he muttered, his voice thick with emotion. Margaret reached over and took his hand, her fingers squeezing gently. It's okay to let go, John. It's okay to see her for who she really is. John sighed. the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. He wasn't ready to fully admit it yet, but deep down, he knew Margaret was right. The emotional climax of the story comes not in a dramatic declaration, but in the quiet shift in both John and Margaret's attitudes. They begin to acknowledge the prejudice that had clouded their judgment and, slowly but surely, let go of the resentment that had kept them from seeing Emily for who she truly was. Margaret's change of heart is more immediate, while John's takes longer. But both come to realize that Emily's dedication and skill are what saved Michael's life. Not once, but multiple times. As Michael's condition continues to improve, the Reynolds family begins to see the nurse they had once doubted as the hero their son needed. The days that followed were marked by a strange stillness. Michael's condition, though still critical, had stabilized for the time being. The frenetic pace of the past weeks slowed, leaving space for reflection and emotional tension to bubble to the surface. Margaret continued to spend long hours at Michael's bedside, but now her gaze often wandered to Emily as she moved quietly around the room, checking vitals and administering care with her usual calm efficiency. A deep sense of gratitude filled Margaret, though she still struggled to find the right words to express it. John, meanwhile, remained distant. He had started to acknowledge, if only to himself, that Emily had saved his son's life multiple times. But the weight of his pride and years of ingrained prejudice made it difficult for him to fully accept. The realization gnawed at him in quiet moments, but he wasn't yet ready to voice it. One evening, after Margaret had returned to their hotel for the night, John found himself wandering into the hospital chapel. The small room was dimly lit, the soft flicker of candles casting long shadows against the walls. He sat in one of the pews, his hands clasped in his lap, and stared at the altar in front of him. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to truly reflect on everything that had happened. The anger he had carried with him for so long now felt hollow, leaving him with a gnawing sense of guilt. He had been so focused on finding someone to blame, Emily, the hospital, anyone, that he had lost sight of what truly mattered. As he sat in the quiet chapel, John's thoughts turned to Emily, the nurse who had been the target of his frustration and prejudice, yet had never faltered in her care for his son. She had shown more grace and resilience than he had ever given her credit for. For the first time, John began to wonder if the problem had been him all along. The next morning, as Emily was making her rounds, she found Margaret waiting outside Michael's room. Margaret's expression was tense, her eyes red-rimmed as if she had been crying. "Emily," Margaret said quietly, her voice unsteady, "could I talk to you for a moment?" Emily nodded, her demeanor professional but open. She followed Margaret down the hallway to a quiet corner, away from the hustle and bustle of the ER. For a long moment, Margaret said nothing. She fidgeted with her hands, her gaze flicking to the floor as she struggled to find the right words. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost hesitant. "I don't know how to thank you," Margaret began, her eyes welling with tears. "You've done so much for Michael, and we've treated you horribly." Emily remained quiet, allowing Margaret the space to express what had been building up inside her for so long. "I was so quick to judge you," Margaret continued, her voice trembling. "We both were. I let my own assumptions blind me to who you really are, and for that I'm truly sorry." Emily's heart swelled with emotion, but she kept her voice gentle. "It's okay, Mrs. Reynolds, I understand." "No," Margaret said firmly, shaking her head. "It's not okay. You saved my son's life, more than once. And I should have seen that from the start." Emily offered a small, understanding smile. "What matters is that Michael is getting better. That's all I care about." Margaret's tears spilled over, and for a moment she seemed overwhelmed by the weight of her emotions. But as Emily reached out to offer a comforting hand, Margaret took a deep breath and steadied herself. "Thank you," Margaret whispered again, her voice filled with a deep sense of sincerity. Emily gave a quiet nod. "You're welcome." Later that day, John sat alone in the hospital cafe, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, gratitude, guilt, and the lingering remnants of his stubborn pride. He had spent weeks blaming Emily for things beyond her control, all while she had been working tirelessly to keep his son alive. The weight of that realization sat heavily on his chest, making it difficult to breathe. As he stared down at his cup, he felt a presence beside him. Looking up, he saw Peter, his longtime friend, sliding into the seat across from him. Peter had been checking in on the family throughout Michael's ordeal, offering support and counsel whenever he could. "I heard about Michael's improvement," Peter said gently, his eyes searching John's face. "That's good news." John nodded, though his expression remained somber. "It is." Peter studied him for a moment before speaking again. "I've also heard a lot about that nurse. Emily, right? Sounds like she's been instrumental in keeping Michael alive." John's jaw tightened and he looked away, the familiar defensiveness rising in his chest. "She's just doing her job," he muttered, though the words felt hollow even as he said them. Peter raised an eyebrow, his tone gentle but firm. "Maybe, but from what I've seen, she's gone above and beyond." John said nothing, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. Peter sighed, leaning forward slightly. "Sometimes the hardest thing isn't admitting that we were wrong. It's letting go of the pride that keeps us from seeing the truth." John's shoulders slumped, and for the first time, he allowed himself to fully confront the truth that had been gnawing at him for weeks. "I've been a fool," John said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I let my own prejudice get in the way of seeing what was right in front of me." Peter gave him a sympathetic smile. "It's never too late to make things right." That evening, John found Emily as she was preparing to leave the hospital after another long shift. He had spent hours thinking about what he wanted to say, but now that he was standing in front of her, the words seemed to escape him. "Emily," John began, his voice hesitant. I wanted to talk to you." Emily paused, her expression unreadable as she looked at him. She had dealt with so much from this man, his accusations, his distrust, and yet she stood before him, patient and calm, waiting for him to speak. John swallowed hard, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. "I owe you an apology," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "I've treated you terribly, and I was wrong." Emily remained silent, allowing him to continue. "I was blinded by my own prejudice," John admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "I couldn't see past it, even when you were the one saving my son's life. I let my pride get in the way, and for that, I'm truly sorry." For a long moment, Emily said nothing. John braced himself for whatever response might come, unsure if he even deserved her forgiveness. But when Emily finally spoke, her voice was soft and kind. "Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. That means a lot." John nodded, relief washing over him, though the weight of his actions still sat heavily on his shoulders. "I don't know how to make it right," he confessed, "but I want you to know that I see you now, for who you really are, and I'm grateful for everything you've done for my son." Emily gave him a small, understanding smile. "We all have things to learn," she said quietly. "What matters is that we're willing to grow." John extended his hand and Emily took it, the gesture sealing the new understanding between them. It wasn't an easy resolution, but it was a start. A few weeks later, Michael was well enough to be discharged from the hospital. To celebrate his recovery, the Reynolds family organized a small gathering in the hospital lobby, inviting the medical team that had cared for him. Emily hesitated when she received the invitation, unsure if she wanted to attend. But after some thought, she decided to go. She knew that this was an important moment, not just for the Reynolds family, but for her own journey as well. The lobby was modestly decorated with balloons and a table of refreshments provided by the hospital staff. Michael sat in a wheelchair, smiling broadly as he greeted each person who came to wish him well. When Emily entered the room, she was met with a wave of warmth and gratitude from the medical team and the Reynolds family alike. Margaret was the first to approach her, wrapping her in a tight hug. "Thank you," Margaret whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "For everything." John followed closely behind, his expression one of quiet sincerity. "You've done more for us than I could ever put into words," he said softly. "Thank you." Emily smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "It's been my pleasure." Later that evening, as she left the hospital and made her way home, Emily allowed herself a moment of quiet pride. She had made a difference, not just for Michael, but for his entire family. And that, more than anything, was what truly mattered. That night, back in her small apartment, Emily sat on her worn-out sofa with a cup of tea in hand. The soft hum of the city outside her window provided a comforting backdrop as she reflected on the events of the past weeks. She picked up her journal and began to write, her thoughts flowing easily onto the page. Today I saw the power of grace unfold in unexpected ways. It wasn't in grand gestures or loud declarations, but in the small, quiet moments of understanding and connection. Sometimes the hardest battles are fought within, and the greatest victories are the ones that open our hearts to change. I'm grateful for the chance to be a part of that journey, for Michael, for his family, and for myself. As she closed the journal, Emily felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. She knew there would be more challenges ahead, more families to care for, more lives to touch, but for now, she was content to simply be. The night outside was still, the city lights twinkling like 1,000 silent affirmations of the quiet heroism that unfolded every day. And in her small apartment, Emily Davis, the nurse who never stopped believing in the power of grace, rested with the knowledge that she had made a difference in ways that truly mattered. In the days following Michael's discharge from the hospital, life began to return to normal for the Reynolds family. Michael was continuing his recovery at home, and although there were still hurdles ahead, the worst was behind them. John and Margaret found themselves reflecting on the ordeal more often than they expected. The experience had shaken them, not just because of their son's close brush with death, but because it had forced them to confront parts of themselves they had never questioned before. For John, the realization that his own prejudices had clouded his judgment was difficult to accept. He had spent so long living in his own world of privilege and control, believing that people like Emily were somehow less capable or deserving of respect. Now he understood how wrong he had been. Margaret, too, felt the weight of her own misjudgments. While she had been quieter in her distrust of Emily, she knew that her silence had contributed to the strain between them. But unlike John, she had begun to let go of her biases more quickly, recognizing Emily's strength and skill, even as John struggled to come to terms with his own feelings. A few weeks after Michael's discharge, Emily received an unexpected letter at the hospital. It was from John Reynolds. She opened it cautiously, unsure of what to expect. Inside, the letter was written in John's careful, neat handwriting. Dear Emily, I've thought a lot about the time we spent at the hospital, and I've come to realize that there are things I never said that I should have. So I'm writing this letter to try to put those things into words. First, I want to apologize again for the way I treated you. My behavior was unfair, and I let my own prejudice get in the way of seeing the truth. I realize now that you were the one who saved my son's life, not just once, but multiple times. And for that, I will be forever grateful. I know that saying thank you doesn't begin to cover the debt I owe you, but I want you to know that I see you now for who you truly are, a compassionate, dedicated, and highly skilled nurse. You didn't just save Michael, you saved our family. And for that, I am profoundly thankful. I've spent a lot of time thinking about my own actions and how I can be better. I don't want to be the person who judges someone based on appearances or preconceived notions. I want to be someone who sees people for who they truly are, as you saw Michael for the scared, hurt young man that he was when he came into your care. I hope that one day we can meet again under better circumstances. Until then, please know that I am grateful for everything you did for our family. Sincerely, John Reynolds. Emily smiled softly as she read the letter, her heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and peace. It wasn't easy for someone like John to admit his mistakes, and the fact that he had taken the time to write this letter spoke volumes about the personal growth he had undergone. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her pocket, feeling a sense of closure settle over her. John had made amends in his own way, and that was enough for her. Back at the hospital, Emily continued her work with the same dedication and grace she had always shown. The experience with the Reynolds family had been challenging, but it had also reaffirmed her commitment to her profession. In the months that followed, Emily received a promotion to head nurse in the ER, a position she had worked toward for years. Her colleagues celebrated her achievement, and even Dr. Patel, who had always supported Emily, expressed her pride in her growth and leadership. Emily, you've always been one of the best nurses here, Dr. Patel said during a staff meeting. Now, the entire hospital knows it too. Emily smiled, feeling the quiet pride of someone who had worked hard and finally been recognized for her efforts. But even as she took on her new role, her focus remained on her patients, on the lives she touched every day, often in ways they never even realized. Months passed, and the memory of the Reynolds family gradually faded into the background of Emily's busy life at the hospital. But the lessons she had learned during that time stayed with her, shaping her understanding of herself and the people she served. One evening, as she sat in her apartment after a long shift, Emily found herself thinking about John, Margaret, and Michael. She wondered how they were doing, whether Michael had fully recovered, whether John had continued to reflect on his own growth. Emily pulled out her journal and began to write, her thoughts flowing easily onto the page. Grace is not something you give because someone deserves it. It's something you offer because you choose to. It's a gift, not an obligation. And in those moments when it's hardest to give, that's when it matters most. Looking back, I realized that the real transformation wasn't just about the Reynolds family seeing me for who I truly am. It was about all of us learning that grace, forgiveness, and understanding are the things that truly heal. We are all flawed. We all make mistakes. But when we open our hearts to change, to empathy, to connection, that's when we find our truest selves. As she finished writing, Emily closed the journal and smiled to herself. The road ahead would still be filled with challenges, but she knew now, more than ever, that she had the strength to face them. A few months later, Emily received a phone call from Margaret. She hadn't expected to hear from the Reynolds family again, but Margaret's voice on the other end of the line was warm and filled with gratitude. Emily, I just wanted to call and thank you again, Margaret said. Michael is doing so well, and we owe that to you. I know we've said it before, but I just wanted you to know how much you've meant to us. Emily smiled, feeling a surge of warmth in her chest. I'm so glad to hear that Michael is doing better. That's all that matters to me. Margaret paused for a moment, then added, John wanted me to let you know that he's been doing some volunteer work at the hospital. He said it's his way of giving back, of trying to make amends. Emily's smile widened. That's wonderful to hear. I'm glad he's found a way to give back. After they ended the call, Emily sat for a moment in quiet reflection. The journey with the Reynolds family had been long and difficult, but in the end, it had led to something beautiful. A transformation, not just for John and Margaret, but for Emily herself. Grace, she realized, had the power to heal wounds, bridge divides, and create connections that went far beyond the walls of the hospital. In the years that followed, Emily's reputation at the hospital continued to grow. She became known not just for her skill and expertise, but for her quiet strength and compassion. Families who came to the ER in their darkest moments found comfort in her presence, knowing that they were in capable hands. But for Emily, the true reward was in the lives she touched, the patients she saved, the families she comforted, and the colleagues she mentored. She never sought recognition or praise, but she found fulfillment in the simple act of caring for others. As the years passed, Emily often thought back to the Reynolds family. Their story had become a reminder of the power of grace and the importance of never giving up, even when faced with the hardest challenges. And in those moments of quiet reflection, she knew that the legacy she was leaving behind wasn't in the awards or promotions she had earned, but in the lives she had touched along the way. On a quiet evening years later, Emily sat on her apartment balcony, sipping a cup of tea and watching the sun set over the city. The world around her hummed with the familiar sounds of life, a reminder of the countless people who move through each day, facing their own battles, seeking their own grace. As the sky darkened and the stars began to appear, Emily closed her eyes and took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. She had walked a long road, one filled with challenges, heartache, and moments of doubt. But through it all, she had remained true to herself, guided by a quiet strength and an unwavering belief in the power of grace. And in the end, that was enough. The night outside was still, the city lights twinkling like 1,000 silent affirmations of the quiet heroism that unfolded every day, often unseen but always present. And in her small apartment, Emily Davis, the nurse who never stopped believing in the power of grace, rested with the knowledge that she had made a difference in ways that truly mattered. As Emily sat on her balcony, reflecting on the journey she had walked and the lives she had touched, she realized how important it was for others to hear stories of resilience, grace, and redemption. The lessons learned, the challenges faced, and the power of quiet strength should never go untold. Turning to her phone, she thought about the countless people who could be inspired by stories like hers, and how these moments of grace could reach even more hearts. She smiled softly as an idea formed in her mind. Emily stood up and walked inside, heading to her desk, where she quickly jotted down a few thoughts for the future. She knew there was more to share, not just her own story, but those of countless others working tirelessly every day to make a difference. And now she wanted to encourage others to join her in this journey of compassion and healing. If you've been inspired by Emily's story, or if you believe in the power of grace and quiet heroism, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Together, we can continue to share powerful stories of transformation, healing, and the strength that comes from within. By subscribing, you'll be the first to hear more stories that uplift, challenge, and inspire, reminding us all that even in the toughest moments, there is always a path forward. Hit the subscribe button below and join us in spreading hope and kindness one story at a time. Thank you for being part of this journey.